Good evening. Good evening. Waiting for a few people to join us this evening. My name is Kurt Owens. I serve as president of the Milwaukee Declaration, and we've been coming together doing pastor forums on race in America. Just really trying to, help the conversation along for people who want to have the conversation and what that looks like, and how do we do that around the gospel. And so I'm joined here today by fellow members of the Milwaukee Declaration. And so today we have Pastor Kevin Penrose from Unity Lutheran Church. And we have Pastor Peter Bork from City Brook Church. We have Kurt Boyd from Way of the Cross Church. And we have Pastor Jay English from Plain English. And joining us today as well is Keisha Wilkerson from the Impact Movement. And again, just to give a little background about the Milwaukee Declaration, it was co-founded some years ago by Bishop Walter Harvey and Matt Erickson, I think during the time of Dontre Hamilton unrest in the city of Milwaukee. And it was at that point in time that they decided to come together to kind of bridge the gap between ethnic communities and to bring some peace around that. And when the Sherman Park unrest came, it was right around the time that I began to get involved with the Milwaukee Declaration as well. But again, it was pastors across all ethnic backgrounds and cultures actually coming together, standing, against the racial divides in our city. And so we've been doing this now for a little while, and just have had the opportunity to develop some amazing relationships across racial lines. And so today we're just going to have some conversation. And if you're watching, you're joining us, and you have some questions, please feel free to share those questions, and we'll try to answer those questions as best as we can. And so I'm going to begin us off, and Kurt Boyd, I'm going to throw the first question over at you. And the question I'm going to ask is, what do you say to people who ask, why is it that Black people have nothing to say about Black on Black crime?
Uh, First, I would say, well, thank you, Kurt, for this initiative. I think it's an awesome format and absolutely well needed, much needed, I should say, in times like these. It's important that we be intentional, engaging in these types of conversations in this platform. So thank you so much. Kudos to you and the Milwaukee Declaration for being consistent in this kind of initiative. For persons who will say, how come Black folks don't say much about Black on Black crime? That's the question. I don't think that's true. I think Black people do complain about Black on Black crime. You don't see a lot of protests about Black on Black crime. And I think the misconception is, here it is from my perspective. When Pookie shoots Ray Ray and Ray Ray dies, when Pookie get caught, Pookie goes to jail. But when Officer Hootie Hoo shoots Pookie on camera and Officer Hootie Hoo get caught, Officer Hootie Hoo don't go to jail. Officer Hootie Hoo go home. And that's the protest.
Thanks for sharing, Pastor Kurt. Pastor Jay, I'm going to pass that same question over to you. What do you say to people who say, why don't Black people have anything to say about Black on Black crime? And most of the time you hear that is probably during the times of, when we hear about some of the injustices that happen. So how could you speak into that?
I'm still getting over Officer Hootie Hoo, so y'all give me a minute. But really,
things have been changed to protect the innocent.
Honestly, so I have a field day with the whole topic because people are bringing up, well, what about Black on Black crime? So here's my question. When is the last time you heard about Hispanic on Hispanic crime? Or Hmong on Hmong crime? What are the statistics of Asian on Asian crime? I want to know, because nobody ever talks about that. That's not even a thing. It actually sounds funny even saying it. So you have this thing called black on black crime that has been perpetuated by our media, and they provide numbers on it and everything else. So some of the statistics are that about 93% of black people are killed by other black people. They don't talk about the fact that 84% of white people are killed by white people. Because you're typically, when you're committing crime, you're committing it in the areas that you live. And if you live in, most of us live in areas with other people that look like us. So those are some of the realities. When you talk about black on black crime, number one, I don't feel like that's justified because we're not talking about anyone else's same situation. The second reality of this entire thing is that we cannot look at it just that way of just black on black, like we're not angry about it. The work that's being done by activists, the things that people are trying to push through, again, people are associating it with what they see or don't see on the news. I have worked with families that have lost children to gun violence. There is no way in the world you're going to tell me that there was no uproar. You're not going to tell me I've seen the grief. I've heard the screams. I've seen parents trying to get in the casket. There is crazy uproar through the family, through the community, through people that know the families, through people that work for Office of Violence Prevention here in Milwaukee and the other organizations that come around that, through ComForce and all these other places. It's just not covered that way. So when people say, well, where's all the uproar? Trust me, come down here. Let's do some real work where none of the cameras are. And I promise you, you'll see all of the uproar that doesn't get covered.
Thanks for sharing, Pastor Jay. Keisha, I'm gonna throw that same question over to you. What do you say to people who ask the question, why don't Black people have anything to say about black on black crime?
Yeah, I'll just second both with what Reverend Kirk and Pastor Jay English has said. The same thing is that there is work that's being done to fight against the crime that's happening in Black neighborhoods. There's tons of nonprofit organizations that are created to address those different things. There's people that have after school programs, that have programs for helping single parents, and like all kinds of different programs to try to bring support to the communities that are facing high crime. And I will also add to it is that the issue of crime is more connected to poverty than it is to anything else. It's not a racial issue, it's a poverty issue. When you have no hope, you commit crime because there's no reason not to obey the law. Why am I obey the law where I have no hope for my future? So I think it's important that we stop thinking about, oh, that's black on black. Why we're not talking about one? We are talking about it, but then also it's not. That's not the issue. Really, the issue is poverty. People are committing crime because of what they're facing, the lack of hope that they have.
Thanks for sharing, Keisha. I appreciate all the answers on that, and just to add to that, as I talk to some of my white brothers and sisters who are not on the forefront in the city of Milwaukee, they actually don't get the opportunity to hear about what's being done when it comes to black on black crime. And one of the things that I mentioned is if you're white and you live outside of the community of Milwaukee, you're probably never going to hear about what's being done on black on black crime because you're not connected to it. And the reason why you hear more about the injustices of whites harming blacks is because you're white. So when you're talking about people dealing with black on black crime, you're going to hear I'm going to talk to black people about black on black crime because that's where the issue is at. And so just kind of opening up people's minds around the concept of just because the news is not covering it does not mean that it's not happening. And Jay, you mentioned earlier about the Office of Violence Prevention. That's never on the news on Fox 6, but you got a whole Office of Violence Prevention that's happening in the community, and you got people that are going door to door, to try to cut down on some of the violence that's happening in our community, and many organizations and people that are working towards, preventing some of the violence that's happening in our community. And so hopefully, this the answers to this question provides a little insight to those that may have asked that question. I'm going to move on to another question. And Peter, I'm going to pose this question to you. And some of the questions that many other questions that we have today that we'll be going over are questions that have come across me from both the Black and white community. And so we want to try to address some of these questions. Peter, a question I'm going to ask you is, why is it when injustices happen to Black people, rather than call it out, some white Christians will point to something that distract from it?
That's a great follow-up question to the question you just asked, because essentially I only ever incur people talking about, white people that is, talking about Black on Black crime when they're confronted with a reality about America that they don't want to have to engage in. And so they throw Black on Black crime up as a smokescreen that allows them to kind of keep their nice, pretty picture in their mind about what America is, even though it isn't really that at all, so that they don't have to address how it is that they benefit from the systems that have been designed from 400 years ago on through today to benefit white people in this country. They don't have to take any responsibility for solving things that they feel like aren't their fault, even though they benefit from it. They're really just trying to distract their own psyche from having to deal with difficult stuff. And so it's really unfortunate. And I think they pick and choose about that. Some of them will, they can talk your ear off about the injustices of abortion, for instance, but then they're unwilling to go ahead and talk about injustices that don't affect them or they don't perceive affect them.
Thanks for sharing, Peter. Kevin, Pastor Kevin, I'm going to pose that same question to you. Why is it when injustices happen to Black people, rather than call it out, some white Christians will point to something that will distract from it?
Yeah, I think it comes down to being confronted with something that makes us uncomfortable. And the natural reaction to discomfort is to push it away, put a wall up, defend ourselves. So a recent example could be the tragedy of the young child, Cannon Hinnant. There's this hashtag Justice for Cannon. And people were using that not simply to grieve for the tragedy and to have empathy with the family that we all share in, but using that hashtag to somehow discredit the Black Lives Matter movement, that, the media isn't paying attention to this tragedy when a white boy is killed by a Black man. And I lost count how many times I had to explain to people that these situations are very, very different, right? The perpetrator of that crime was a citizen, not sworn to protect. The perpetrator of that crime was caught within 24 hours. We're still waiting on any accountability for the perpetrators against Breonna Taylor. The justice system will work for the Hinnant family, and the justice system doesn't work for unarmed Black people who are killed by police. And so if you wanted a direct comparison, you'd have to talk about Tamir Rice, who was a young 12-year-old Black boy killed playing by himself. Police showed up and shot him almost instantly. And so to see the difference in those two situations, why we cry out for justice when there's injustice, and but we're not crying out for justice when justice is served.
Thanks for sharing, Kevin. Appreciate that. Um, Jay, I'm gonna pose a question, throw it over to you. And that question is, what do you say to people who say, why should I be held accountable for what America did to black people 200 years ago when I had nothing to do with it?
I think there's a misperception. We talk about 200 years ago, they're acting as if things aren't still happening. I'll give you just very quickly, let's look at something as simple to understand as the Tuskegee experiment, where black men who had syphilis were told they were being treated by our government officials, found out they weren't. That went from 1932 to 1972. They found out that penicillin can cure syphilis in 1947. Never told them, just let them die off. People will say, well, the stuff that happened 200 years ago, my grandfather was born in 1928. Tuskegee experiment started in 1932. My mother was born in 1954. Tuskegee experiment was still happening. It ended in 72. I was born in 1980. Like, that experiment ended 8 years before I was born. So, I laugh at this 200-year thing because no, this stuff is still happening. I literally posted a post today about African-American babies that are dying at a much higher rate. Things are still happening. There's still things going on. There's still injustices going on. There's still systematic issues that we're facing. Literally, Pastor Kevin just talked about the Breonna Taylor situation. Let me go into the wrong house and shoot somebody, and then claim self-defense because they shot me first. I promise you, it'll look very differently. So we can't talk about 200 years ago because the things that were happening 200 years ago, some of those things are still happening now. We're still facing some of those situations. Black bodies are still being placed in incarceration for many times things they have not done. We're having laws enacted on our communities that are not being enforced. Like, let's take the mask. Let's take quarantining. I see a whole lot of my friends out in Brookfield and everywhere else during the quarantine. They was out marching and all type of stuff with the police. People over here in the inner city is getting $500 tickets for getting caught outside. It looks very different. So no, 200 years ago, no, 2 weeks ago, we got a lot of stuff still happening that we got to fix.
Thanks for sharing, Jay. Pastor Peter, I'm going to pose that same question to you. Is what do you say to people who say, why should I be held accountable for what America did to black people 200 years ago when I had absolutely nothing to do with it?
Those people are trying to use the fact that they didn't own slaves, their family didn't own slaves, their family immigrated from Hungary in 1908 or whatever it is, as yet again a way that they don't have to go ahead and engage intellectually, spiritually, emotionally with the trauma of being Black in America. And it comes down to a historical misunderstanding as well, because there's this thought that slavery existed in the United States because white people here were racist. And actually the exact opposite is true. As a PhD in history, I can tell you the exact opposite is true, that racism did not cause slavery, slavery caused racism. And racism still exists. So it doesn't matter whether something was going on 200 years ago and your family wasn't even in America at that point, because the after effects of that item, that issue, slavery, is racism, and racism still is pervasive throughout the entire nation in institutions and in communities and in words and in movies and in blog posts and in conspiracy theories and on and on and on and on. It still needs to go ahead and be dealt with. So I think it's just it's a false pretense that people use to try to wash their hands of a national problem that affects everybody. Frederick Douglass famously wrote in his autobiography that slavery not only harmed the slaves, quite obviously, but also showed how it's harmed the slave holders. And the same thing can be true of racism. And so racism today not only harms you and Jay and Keisha and Kurt, but it goes ahead and harms all those who hold the racist attitudes and then act on those attitudes. So it's yet another distraction that people try to use to protect themselves from having to feel and mourn and experience empathy. It's very un-Christ-like.
Thanks for sharing, Peter. And I think you know, it's really important to acknowledge. I think when the complaints and the protests are happening, I don't think it's a shot at holding people accountable for what happened 200 years ago. Specifically, I hold the church accountable for not correcting, you know, the any inequities that transpire in our community. Like I said, and I always say this, like I have no expectation of the world. I don't care what the world is doing, but for the church, like man, you know, that's where my refuge is at, and I just have higher expectations for the church. And so not being held accountable for what happened 200 years ago, but being held accountable for not you know, addressing the inequities that exist today because of what happened 200 years ago. And Kurt, I'm going to throw that same question over to you. Is what do you say to people who say, why should I be held accountable for what America did to Black people 200 years ago that I had absolutely nothing to do with?
Dr. King said it best. A threat to justice anywhere is a threat to injustice everywhere, something like that. But it's not so much we hold white people accountable, but I saw a sign during this protest that was so profound, and there happened to be a white person carrying the sign that said, it read, white silence is violence. And racism is not a Black and white issue. It's an American issue. And it affects all of us, you know. It's and so, you know, people fear what they don't understand, and they hate what they fear. And so if that conversation of racism makes people feel uncomfortable, yeah, they'll start to sweep it under the rug, and they'll say, why come we have to talk about that? That happened 200 years ago, and this, that, and the other thing. And it's because it makes, like I think Kevin alluded to, that it makes them feel uncomfortable having to face that we still have a serious racism problem in America, like Jay Joseph was talking about. Now it's systemic, right? It's in a system. They tell us where we can and cannot move. We can't move in certain neighborhoods because we're redlined. We don't get the application loan. We don't get approved for this, and it's all in the system now. And so it's still happening. It's just that now they're not riding down the street, grabbing somebody and go take them up and hanging them and calling it a picnic. It's a different kind of racism. And so it's still prevalent, and it's still ugly, and it's still a sin. And I agree with you, Kurt, that the church has remained silent on this issue for too long. Dr. King said it best. We wouldn't have a race issue in this country if we didn't first have a race issue in our churches. And the church is a sleeping giant, and the church needs to be held accountable just as much as silent white folk who know better.
Thanks for sharing, Kurt. I appreciate that. And for those again that's joining us, you know, our whole spirit behind this is, again, we want to help kind of lead the conversation. Our goal is to unify the body of Christ across racial lines, and in order to do that, we have to have some tough conversations and kind of help lead those conversations as we do. Keisha, I'm gonna pose a question to you. And that question is, do you personally know of anyone who has benefited from affirmative action?
I don't know how to answer that question. I know, so what I understand, I'll share what I understand about the affirmative action. Affirmative action primarily has benefited white women more than it has benefited anybody else. And that's the reality. And a lot of times people assume that people of color benefit from it the most, but really, statistically, white women have benefited the most. But then also, affirmative action doesn't just apply to women and people of color, but it also applies to people that have parents that have attended the university as well. So I think people have misconceptions about affirmative action and assume that every person of color is at a university because of affirmative action. And to be to be completely honest, as someone that went to college myself, I worked hard to go to college. And I believe that, if affirmative action was not an option, I had a good enough grades and experience in student organization involvement to be able to get in college with or without affirmative action. And I think it's a misconception that's surrounded around that, assuming that people of color get this free pass into universities and are taking spots from white people, assuming that spots in college is for only white people. And it's not. It's for anybody that has a desire to further their education.
Thank you, Keisha, for sharing. Pastor Kevin, I'm going to pass that same question over to you. Do you personally know of anyone who have benefited from affirmative action? Kevin, you're muted.
The short answer is no. Just to echo what Keisha was saying, the perception is that affirmative action gives people a leg up, that gives them something they don't deserve. And so, no, I have never met somebody who benefited from affirmative action who didn't already deserve to be in college or to have access to what they've earned. Affirmative action is an attempt to look at an imbalance in the system and try to bring balance to it. But in that effort of bringing balance, I've never met a person who didn't already have the skills or the work ethic or the criteria themselves, but what they lacked was the same access that others had. And so I've never met someone who benefited, quote unquote, from affirmative action because they deserved what they got.
Thanks for sharing, Kevin. And I'll just throw it out there. I'm 50 years old, and I've never met anyone actually that have benefited from affirmative action. And so I don't have much more to say about that other than I've had people that have asked me, or made the comment that their child received reverse racism because of affirmative action. And it just blew my mind because I don't know anybody who's benefited from affirmative action. And so that's a question that we're going to continue to pass around. I'm actually going to let everybody answer that question. So Peter, I'm going to throw it over to you.
I'd like to take a different kind of look at this. My great grandfather on my dad's side, one of my great grandfathers on my dad's side, moved here from Sweden in the early 1900s, didn't speak any English, was a bricklayer, ended up starting his own masonry company, which he gave to my grandfather, who then grew it into a very large general contracting company. If anyone listening has been to the House of Blues in downtown Chicago, my grandfather was the general contractor that built that. My father didn't want to run it, so my grandfather sold off all the assets of the company, and my dad and his sisters inherited a lot of money when my grandparents died as a result. A Black person living in the United States in the early 1900s would not have had the ease that my grandfather did, an immigrant who didn't speak English, to go ahead and start a company that could, generation to generation, end up benefiting children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren. There's a great book by an author named Ira Katznelson that talks about When Affirmative Action Was White, is the title. And it looks at the GI Bill, for instance, as something that was disproportionately beneficial and like massively disproportionately beneficial to white veterans at the expense of African American veterans. And so there's this misperception of the idea of affirmative action that kind of narrowly looks at it as something that has been recently created, as Kevin mentioned, to try to go ahead and right historic inequities, which is a legitimate process. But for 400, or let's say for 370 years prior to that, or 350 years prior to that, everything in America was designed to help white people. Why don't we consider that affirmative action?
All right, Peter, you're gonna get us in trouble around here. Appreciate you sharing. Appreciate you sharing. He just dropped the mic too. Just no, interesting conversation. Again, our conversation is not meant to be divisive. It's meant to be enlightening for both our brothers and sisters all across the aisle of race. And again, just trying to help bring some enlightenment to it. And so, Pastor Jay, I'm going to pose that same question to you. Do you personally know of anyone that has benefited from affirmative action?
So this is a weird answer because in a weird backhanded sort of way, I think I did, which I definitely know myself. So I think I count. I got into an argument with a Caucasian girl in my high school. So graduated high school. I ended up going to a college, doing a tour. There was some affirmative action programming going on at that school to try to bring in more minorities. I got into a conversation with one of the ladies overseeing the program. I explained to her what my ACT score was. I actually scored really high on my ACT. And she found out my number and she was like, there's a program here that could help you pay for college and everything. I applied, I ended up getting it. And I remember going back to school and telling what I thought, friends and stuff about this great thing that had happened. And somebody told me, so you got a scholarship because you're Black? I was like, wait. I got a 3.9 GPA. I'm the salutatorian of the school and I'm getting an academic scholarship because of a program that was put in place to bring more minorities in. So in a way, yes, but I agree 100% with Pastor Kevin. I don't care what the program is. Nobody is giving you anything if you can't produce. The end. No one's hiring you. No one's hiring somebody they know they got to fire. Nobody is bringing anybody in. It's going to cost them more money to keep. Nobody is giving a scholarship to anybody that they know is going to be a waste of their time or money, regardless of what the program says. So I think affirmative action is a great term that had to be utilized to give people that look like us opportunities in the first place. But the reality is, if we weren't good enough to be in that spot, we wouldn't be there. We wouldn't be there anyway.
Thanks for sharing, Pastor Jay. Pastor Kurt, gonna pass it over to you. Do you personally know of anyone who have benefited from affirmative action?
I've been here. I've been trying to think. I'm like Jay. I don't know, not personally. You see, when I was coming up, affirmative action was called. White people call it affirmative action. Black people refer to it as token Black person, where you had to have a token Black person to make it look good in the company. I worked for a company for 29 years. And out of the front office, there was 300 persons in the front office. I was the only Black person in that front office. I graduated high school on a 0.0.9 grade point average. In the front office in marketing at this corporate. Is that affirmative action or is that token Black? You decide. But that's what we looked at it as a token Black person. And it was offensive. Affirmative action, it was offensive. To Jay's point, you get the job because if you're an employer and you got 2 applications and you see Leroy Jenkins versus Tom Bruskinowski, then you probably going to push Leroy Jenkins to the side and look at Bruskinowski, right? But if the powers that be were coming down on you and they say, listen, you need to get some more diversity in your company, then they pull Leroy Jenkins out. whether he was qualified or not, I don't know. But affirmative action was always, that term was offensive to me because I've always viewed it as tokenism. And so personally, I don't think I know anybody personally who's benefited, because you can never tell, right? You don't know if they qualified or if they were the best candidates, or if the company or the organization just needed some diversity.
Appreciate you for sharing, Pastor Kurt. Next questions, like a little bit more controversial. Y'all ready to go? Let's do it. Pastor Jay, I'm gonna throw this to you.
Oh man, you gonna start me off with the controversy?
So what do you say to people who ask, why is it okay for Black people to use the N-word?
Okay, so now you're gonna make me answer this in the way that I actually respond to them. So don't nobody look at me differently when I get off this call. When people ask why, I say, first of all, the first thing I'll say is there's a way that we say it, and there's a way that it has been said, which are two very different things. If you put that hard ER on the end of it, that has a very different meaning. We don't do that. Secondly, it's kind of like just using something that's been used against you for so long. And I'm not saying that this is right. I'm just saying this is what we've done. We said we're going to take the word and use it in whatever way we want to use it to take some of the power away. So now a term that was used to be derogatory, that was used to, offend, we use it many times as a term of endearment for friends and family. Again, not saying that it's right. Some of us use it more than others. And I still advise people that don't look like me, don't use it in either of the terms. That'll get you in all kinds of trouble. So why? Because as African Americans, that term was utilized against us, and many of us have taken that and we've utilized it in a very different way to try to negate some of the authority and some of the power that comes along with it. Is that, a double standard? You can call it that, but it's kind of like the same thing of, I can talk about my family, but you can't. It's just some of the things, some of these rules. Is it a double standard? Sure, I can talk about my sister. I can say whatever I want about her because she's my sister. If you say something about my sister, we're going to be fighting. It's very different. So, it's just, that's how I explain it when people ask me that question.
Thanks for sharing, Pastor Jay. Keisha, I'm gonna throw that same question over to you, throwing you right in the hot water. So what do you say to people who ask why it's okay for Black people to use the N-word?
Yeah, I second what was already said, but I also asked the question, why does it matter? Or why do you want to use the word? Because it speaks to a lot of things of like what's the purpose of wanting to use the word? Because it is a word that has been used negatively towards a population of people, and I'm assuming that we're talking about the N-word. So it's a word that's been used negatively towards a group of people. And so why would you want to use that word? And to be honest, I personally don't use the word, and I prefer that other people don't use it, but I'm also not going to judge people that, Black people that decide to use it. But I think it's a good question to ask ourselves as someone that's not Black. Why am I asking this question? Why do I have a desire to want to use that word? Because it does have a negative kind of, the history of it is negative. And particularly if it's coming from someone that's white, a lot of times they're asking that question because they want to be able to call Black people that word and say, well, it's okay. Or, you use it, so I should be able to use it, and not necessarily for the same reasons that Black people try to use it. So I think it's important to consider why is that even a question? Why do I want to be able to use a word that's so hateful that I don't even have the power to make it positive? Only the people that it was hurting have the power to make it a positive, or even to reclaim it, to take some of the power away.
Thanks for sharing, Keisha. Pastor Kurt, I'm gonna throw that same question to you. You don't want it? Okay. Well, I would take. I would. We'll do Kurt the lesser. And I have to I have to speak into this because I mean it's just simply where I come from. Where I come from and the culture that where I come from, we don't say N word. We say what it is. And I got guys. And even the household that I grew up in, like my daddy, I thought my nickname was Little Nigga. So, and then there is a difference, as Pastor Jay said. There's a difference between and and so black people have taken that word, and it's our word. And nobody else can use it but people within the community. And also, let me say, there is I have to say this too. There is a culture of black people where it's offensive when even black people use the word. So there are some people that have grew up during the civil rights movement, and I didn't grow up during the civil rights movement, so I don't have any connection to it. I grew up in the hip hop age where, like, man, my nigga, I'm gonna say the word because I mean that's where I come from. And there's still some people today that, like, I mean that's how they get down, and I mean that's exactly what it is. And so I won't pretend to be something, on the outside, like, unfortunately, the church kind of have a bad rap for that. I am who I am. I'm the same guy, with my guys in the street as I am with my people in the church. And so with those group of people, I mean, I use that language because that's the culture I come from. But it is a term of endearment between a group of people, and so that word that was used to kind of harm or diminish people has now been taken and been used as a term of endearment, and it's become such a cultural name. It's blown my wig back when I've seen the term used among people where there's no black people around. I was just confused, but it's become a cultural. It's become a culture, and so hopefully some of that just kind of helps speak into that a little bit.
Let me just add one thing about that word. I think we've given that word too much power, personally, and I can't stand the double standard. You know, I can call a white person hunky all day, but then as soon as he called me the N word, I want to take him to court, or I'm, it's just such a double standard, and it's so stupid. Yeah, we've given that word way too much authority, too much power. Listen, I'm offended when a white man call me boy. If you really want to make me mad, call me boy, or call me an a-hole or whatever, So I think we've given that word too much power. And I have two sons, and I made sure that I explained to my sons, you could have a group of white kids and say, hey, watch this. I'm going to make Kurt lose his mind. Hey, N-word. And there I go, acting an N-word, because and so I think we've given it too much power, and we've allowed it to infiltrate our culture to the point to where no, we got to say N-word. It's like Prince not calling himself Prince no more. We just get a symbol that means N-word.
Hey, I appreciate you for sharing, man. I really do. Thanks for sharing, and hopefully we've added a little bit enlightenment surrounding the N word. And again, I have to reiterate, there's many people in the black community where black people use it, it's offensive. But there's a culture. Again, there's a culture of people where it is everyday language, every other word. And you really got to begin to think about that when you're talking about that you want to, I mean specifically in the black community, you want to evangelize. We're missing a whole generation of people. I mean, the African American millennial is completely disconnected from the church, and those are the people who, many of them, who who associate with the N word, and and so it's gonna take a real N word to be able to tap into this generation at the end of the day. And it's like, and if you can't go both ways, you want to like, I mean, that's what I say. I mean, it's like, man, I want to say it so bad, but at the end of the day, you know, that's just kind of what it is. And so hopefully, again, we're just helping people just kind of understand the different dynamics. It's not a, you know, it's not an easy road to it, but there's some complexity to it a little bit. So
And you know what, too, Kurt, just one more thing, one more point on that. If I'm a white person and I heard black persons using that word with each other, I would feel some kind of way for that person to tell me that I can't use that word. Who are you to tell me I can't use a word? And who gave you rights to that word? You know what I'm saying? And so that's why it's just such a double standard. And that's what irritates me about it.
Yeah.
But to Kevin and Peter, don't y'all use the word. Just keep on mumbling and walk away.
Kurt, you muted.
Sorry about that. So we're leaving the N word now. Hopefully we spent enough time on it, so everybody's better for it. Peter, I'm gonna throw a question over to you, and that question is: should Christians listen to talk shows that encourage divisiveness between Christian neighbors on the other side of the aisle?
No. Why would they want to? I just I can't get inside the heart and mind of people who think that's a worthwhile use of their time, a worthwhile use of their brain, a appropriate place for their emotions to go. I just, you know, scripture is clear throughout, but, you know, maybe most particularly in Ephesians 2, that Jesus came to break down the dividing wall of hostility. And, you know, in that particular instance, it was between Jew and Gentile, but the principle remains the same, is that, you know, he came, he broke down the dividing wall of hostility between us and the Father. And then as a result, we ought not to have any dividing walls of hostility between ourselves and any other humans. So why feed into our sinful nature in a way that doesn't glorify God? I don't get it. But I think people who do it have made a god out of politics, an idol out of politics, and it's become an ultimate thing to them rather than a tool that God means to use. And oftentimes their political affiliation means more to them than their walk with Christ.
Thanks for sharing, Peter. That's unfortunate. Because at the end of the day, I mean, certainly we're here, we're talking about race, but at the end of the day, we're all proponents of the gospel. And at the end of the day, the gospel should propel beyond any other issue or stance that we take. It's all from within the gospel. So it's a little disappointing when we allow the kingdom of the world to begin to start infiltrating the kingdom of God. Kevin, I'm going to pose that same question to you. Should Christians listen to talk shows that encourage divisiveness between Christian neighbors across the other side of the aisle? And so whether you're talking CNN, Fox News, you know, whatever that is, that where many Christians get their information from.
All right. Well, I'm always hesitant to say a Christian should or should not do something in terms of absolutes. Christ frees us, and as Paul says, free to be that for which the other needs to hear the gospel. So Paul was a Greek to the Greek, a Hebrew to the Hebrews, et cetera, et cetera. So whether it should or should not a Christian listen to these programs, I don't know if I answer that should or shouldn't, but the idea is that how do we use that freedom given to us? the divisiveness of those programs isn't the thing of itself. The divisiveness is a byproduct, right? It's basically a byproduct of ignorance and confirmation bias. That if we don't know better, if we don't have a broader scope of information, and we enter an echo chamber that just regurgitates to us our own biases without challenging those, then that's not a good stewardship of our Christ-given freedom. So I choose not to watch those programs, but I wouldn't say that others shouldn't. There might be reasons that people choose to, if you're looking for a different perspective, if you're that might be a reason to. But I would just frame the question as, how do we steward our freedom to love our neighbor?
Thanks, Kevin. Very insightful. Appreciate that. Pastor Jay, I'm going to pass you that same question. Should Christians spend their time listening to talk shows that encourage divisiveness between Christians on the other side of the aisle?
I think if you're listening to it for the purpose of being divisive or for looking to solidify what your views already are, I think that's to the detriment of yourself and to specifically, we're talking about Christians, your ability to reach people who are outside of your box is going to be limited by that type of thinking. Because then if I run into someone and I have a conversation and I'm unable to even empathize, if I'm unable to even think through an alternative perspective, that's going to cause me to miss out on some opportunities. I think if you're looking to be engaging in conversations and you're purposefully wanting to learn, what do people that don't think like me think? Because let's be honest, any of us can have opinions on a number of things, but that doesn't mean my opinion is right or true. And if I never get around or have conversations with someone else who thinks differently than myself, and I'm only around people that think like I do, I only watch shows that think the way I do, I'm missing out on opportunities to grow, to learn, even to engage in conversations with people across that aisle. I actually think that's part of our problem today in our culture now. Everyone's in such silos where it's black or white. Either you believe what I believe, or you're not a Christian, you believe what I believe, or we can't talk, you believe what I believe, and I can't work with you. And we're missing out on all kinds of opportunities to find the things we do have in common, to find common ground, to find areas where, you know what, I did feel this way, but when I talk to you and I learn some more information, man, you know what? I actually can see it that way. And I think on that topic, I'm going to change my opinion. So for me personally, I recommend people stepping outside of their usual box. If you listen to a certain news station that talks a certain way, I advise you to spend as much time listening to the other side. So at least when you have a conversation or you wanting to make a statement, you can make an informed one based on all the facts, as opposed to just what you believe to be true based on the circle that you've grown up in.
Thanks, Jay. Very insightful. Appreciate you sharing. Keisha, I'm going to pose a question to you. And that question is, why might it be easier for Black Christians to sit under white leadership as opposed to white Christians sitting under Black leadership in the church?
I think it's because we have sat under white leadership before. In whatever atmosphere we've been in, we most likely had white teachers, white principals, white bosses. So we've encountered that before. But then on the other side, for someone that's white and having to come under leadership with someone Black, that requires submission to them to some extent. And depending on their viewpoints and biases towards Black people, that can make it difficult. But then also just never doing it before, and like not realizing that what they've been taught or indirectly taught about Black people and their leadership is affecting their ability to be able to come under them. So I think it's partially because as a Black person, you are required to be in spaces with white people. You won't survive if you're not in places with white people. At some extent, you might not be in places with white people before you get out of high school. It's definitely possible to stay in spaces where it's just Black people or just people that look like you. But as soon as you leave that space, you have to be in spaces with people with white people. So we are used to being in spaces like that, and that's not necessarily the case for someone that's white.
Thank you, Keisha. Again, very insightful. Appreciate your viewpoint there and your sharing. Pastor Kurt, I'm going to pass that same question to you. If you'd be so kind. Why might it be easier for Black Christians to sit under white leadership in the church as opposed to white Christians sitting under the leadership of Blacks in the church?
I don't think it. I don't think it is any easier. The key word is why might it be? Might. I don't think it is easier. I look at what you would call mega churches, for example. If you look at some of the televangelists, Joe Osteen, for example, he has a very diverse crowd, and I look on his front row and I see, some of his, what I would think is his executive team, even Charles Stanley. Look at their executive teams, and they're Black men too. But then when you look at, for example, T.D. Jakes, he has a white mixed congregation, and I'm sure some of his executive team are white men as well and women. And so I don't think it's any different. If your soul is being fed, and that's one thing I appreciate about mega churches. Mega churches tends to breed more diversity. Now, there was a time, there was an article about a couple years ago about how there was an exodus from Black people leaving white churches, white pastors, because the pastors weren't speaking to the need. I think it was during this Trayvon Martin situation. The white pastors were talking so much about pro-police, but they never mentioned Trayvon Martin, justice for Trayvon Martin. And so those Black congregants needs weren't being met, and their situations weren't being addressed. And so there was a mad exodus coming, Black folks coming out of white churches. But I don't think there is a difference. Like I said, with those examples of the 2 or 3 churches I gave, T.D. Jakes, I'm sure he has a whole lot of white men sitting under him. And just like Robert Morris and Charles Stanley and these other guys have a whole lot of Black men sitting under, as long as the gospel is being preached and these people are experiencing spiritual growth, listen, man, there ain't gonna be no black and white heaven. And that's one message we got to understand. There is not gonna, the gospel is colorblind and the blood is red. Glory to God. Don't y'all start me preaching. And we have got, man, that's why racism is so stupid. It's such a, I can't believe we're still talking about this foolishness. Christians. It's just ridiculous. Let me stop before I get upset.
Amen, Pastor Kurt. I had to take the mic from him because he about to get. I think he about to tune up. No, appreciate you sharing, man. Appreciate your perspective. Thank you for that, Pastor Peter. I'm going to pose that same question to you. Why might it be easier for Black Christians to sit under white leadership in the church versus white Christians sitting under Black leadership in the church?
Because white people, even white Christians, or maybe especially white Christians, are proud. The country was built for us by others. The ease has been to be white in this country, and giving leadership over to somebody else, particularly someone who has been dehumanized for almost the entire history of this nation, seems, I think, foolish to some white people. And it is baseline sin that the blood of Jesus should cleanse people of, and can cleanse people of, but for whatever reason, people have decided not to quote unquote wash that part of themselves with what Jesus did on the cross. Other than that, I agree with what Keisha said. You know, my black brothers and sisters, my wife, you have to sit under white leadership at some point in your life. That's just the way the realities of the country work. But white people can choose to live an all white life their entire 60, 70, 80 years in America. But it's just sin. It's absolute sin on the part of white Christians.
Thank you for sharing, Peter. As we continue to push for the gospel, my prayer is that we're going to just we will see more multi-ethnic churches that begin to take shape in our city, in our country, and that just continues the gospel moving forward.
I hear what the white pastor has to say.
Well,
Can I add to that?
Yes, sir.
Thanks, Kurt. Yeah, I can only speak from my point of view. I can't affirm the question. Why is it easier for a black congregant to be under white leadership? But the second part of that question, why might it be more difficult for a white congregant to be under the leadership of a black person? And going back to what Keisha says about how we spend time in our space, our surroundings, and the people around us, not only does the gospel speak to the human condition, which all humans share, but it does so in a way that speaks to the human experience, which that experience can differentiate from context to context and culture to culture. So if the dominant culture beyond the church and society is someplace that, as a white person, is my culture, then being under the leadership of a black person, I've seen that work really well when the black person in leadership maintains the same microculture of the church as a white culture, sing the same hymns, move the same way, talk the same way. But I've seen it be, I've seen conflict in congregations when a pastor of color brings their experience with them, brings their culture with them. Then white congregants aren't used to what we call code switching, or aren't used to being fluent in multicultures. We might like and affirm the idea of being multi-ethnic as a congregation, but then don't realize that the only way of being multi-ethnic is being multicultural. And so there's pushback when leadership starts expanding and broadening to multiculturalism.
Thank you.
You know what? That's true, Kurt. Just one more point to add to that, Kevin. That's true, but that is just not a black pastor coming into a white church. That's a pastor going to any church that don't understand the culture. Because you can go into that church with a good strategy, to incorporate your worship experience. But if you don't understand the culture of that church, I don't care what color you are, culture will eat strategy for breakfast. And so that's a poignant point you made, but that's just not limited to a black pastor coming into a white congregation. That's any pastor going into any congregation trying to bring his worship experience and for lack of a better word, force it on the congregation, and he don't understand that culture, he's going to be in trouble soon.
Interesting conversation. I could speak a whole lot about that from my own experiences, but we will save that for another day. There is a question from someone who's joining us live, and the question is, how do you feel about Christian leaders asked to participate in or attend interfaith platforms, for example, the DNC? And I think I'm a little confused on that question, because I don't see that. I don't know if I see the DNC as an interfaith platform. I see, and I'm assuming that's the Democratic National Convention when we're talking about the DNC. I see that as a political platform. I mean, and I'll let somebody else answer this as well. I mean, but for me, if I'm answering this question, I think Christian leaders should simply, be cognizant of whatever they participate in. But to put down, particular rules for every Christian leader rather across the board wouldn't be something that I would be for. But individually, as many of you know, I don't align myself up with, any political parties or any political anything. That's just not what I've been called to. I've been called to preach the gospel, so I just stick to that. But I wouldn't tell another Christian leader not to. So again, if somebody else want to add to that, we got some smarter people on here tonight than myself, so I will lean on to somebody else to answer that question. And the question again is, how do you feel about Christian leaders asked to participate in or attend interfaith platforms such as the DNC?
I know for me, I've never seen a problem with, I'm not speaking specifically to the DNC. I really try to stay out of that whole political scene when it comes down to what Christians do or don't do. But as far as interfaith activity, I think there's so many things that we can agree on to work on, and the things that we don't, leave them where they are. How do you go out and build relationships? How do you reach people? How do you build community if you're unwilling to go places with anybody that believes something differently than you do? That's what we're fighting right now, with even within this country. So for me personally, I look at interfaith activity. I've been a part of some interfaith organizations and events. I've connected with churches and have done community events with people who completely theologically, we believe two completely different things. But what we could agree on was making sure kids have food to get through the day to day. What we can agree on is, hey, we're going to do what we can to help this family that's in a hard spot. We can agree on book bags and different things for homeless people. We can agree on initiatives that people shouldn't freeze to death during the winter. So the things we can agree on, let's work together. Let's build relationship, because you never know where that leads or what doors that may open later on. I am 100% confident in who I am and what I believe. And I'm happy to engage in conversations with anybody around what they believe as well. I want to learn. I want to know, why do you believe that? How long have you believed that? What led you to those conclusions? It's only going to make me better. It's only going to give me more information. And I never know where those friendships and those relationships, if I'm honest, I have one relationship even now over the past couple of years, completely different belief. But they were one of our donors. Whenever we did things with teenagers in the community of Milwaukee, I knew I could reach out to them and get money for it, because we had relationship that had nothing to do with our theology. So I think you miss out on opportunities when you close yourself off to being around people that don't think the way you do.
Also, thanks for sharing, Pastor Jay. Look like there some more clarification to that question. I think they were saying again, the DNC has some multi-faith gatherings that was a part of the DNC or what have you. But I think that the gist of the question was essentially basically being a part or attending things with other believers of other religious affiliations. And if that's just the case for me, again, I connect with people who have different religious beliefs. I don't get too caught up into the completely being in theological agreement with everybody in order to be in relationship with everybody. I just feel like if what you believe is true, then show it to me and your relationship with me to win me over to what you believe. Show me that your love is great. Well, whatever you believe. And so that's just me. But if anybody else want to take a stab at that, I just want to bring some clarification to that.
Yeah, since I'm already unmuted, I think one of the problems with that is perception. If you don't mind having to explain yourself, for example, if I'm in photo ops and I'm seeing on photographs slapping five and hugging and buddying up with Muslims, for example, or whatever. Or there's this new religious, I don't know if it's so new, but it's new to me, called the Black Muslims. Not the Black Muslims, the Black Hebrews. It wouldn't look right for me to be in photographs, shaking hands and partnering with persons who don't believe Jesus Christ is who he says he is. And if you don't mind having to explain yourself every time those kind of photos pop up, then, and if you guys think that what you're doing is for the greater good of the community, to Jay's point, then, you know, that shouldn't stop you from working with someone. I don't think that's what Jesus would have wanted. He would want us to reach across the aisles, for lack of a better word. But I remember, I forget whose funeral it was on television. Louis Farrakhan was on the platform, and I saw all of these other guys come on the platform, like Jesse Jackson and Al Sharpton, and they sat as far as they could away from Farrakhan so that they could not be in the same photograph almost. They didn't want any affiliations with Farrakhan. And I could never understand why that was, but then after I started thinking about it, perhaps it was because of what I just stated, the controversy in saying that how can you be on stage or in a photo op with Farrakhan knowing what he believes versus what you believe? And I don't fully understand it, but I got a feeling that controversy has a lot to do with it.
Can I take a crack at this?
Take a crack at it, Kevin.
So if I think about, would I personally pray for the well-being of my Jewish neighbor, my atheist neighbor, my Muslim neighbor? Absolutely. I say those prayers. If my Jewish neighbor, Muslim neighbor prays for me, then great. They have me on their heart. They're expressing that in the way they know how to express it. And so if I'm comfortable praying in my house while my neighbor prays in their house, at what point does the proximity, the distance measured, matter? Can I stand on a stage with my neighbor and pray? And the difference for me is when we do that, I'm always and only going to pray as a Christian leader. That's my identity. And I would have the same expectation for a Muslim leader, a Jewish leader, that they would always and only pray from their identity. And so how this might relate, this question of interfaith activity might relate to our discussion on racism, is that racism is a system of white supremacy. As I mentioned, white congregants under a pastor of color, that assumption that there's one dominant culture and we should all assimilate into some, mishmash of dominance. That could be the temptation of interreligious activity, that we would give up our identities and assimilate into some mishmash generic thing. I see it differently. I see it as, I'm going to be true to my identity and my calling. I expect you to be true to your identity and your calling, and we can pray for our well-being together.
Can I add one thing to that, Kurt? Let's just, hypothetically, let's just say the Church of Lucifer, that are Satanists, giving away book bags. Okay. And they want you to come and partner with them, and there's this well-known Satanist pastor there, or whatever they call the leader of the Satanist church. And now you guys are in photo ops together. You can see where that can be, a little, hey, wait a minute, I don't know, right? Maybe it's just me. Unmute yourself.
Okay. All right. All right. Well, hopefully we provided some enlightenment to the question that was asked. And at the end of the day, for me to sum it up, I'm gonna say that like every leader should just really be prayerful and cognizant about it's an individual choice. And I would just again encourage everybody to just be prayerful and cognizant about anything that you connect yourself with. And for me to just end it, there was a saying like what you eat, like Jay-Z said another way, but what you eat don't make me go to the bathroom. So but the last question, the last question we got, and we're gonna get out of here. We're gonna get out of here. Why y'all laughing? um, last question, and Pastor Peter, I'm gonna pose it to you, and we'll all have an opportunity to answer this question, and we'll end our night. But the question I'm gonna pose to you, Peter, is why is it that every time a bad cop is identified in America, some people will say that only less than 1% of officers are bad. So where's this number coming from?
Well, I don't know where the number is coming from, but I do know that Chris Rock has done a great stand-up routine about this. And he equates it to like talking about, oh, that cop who just did something horrific is a bad apple. And he says, doesn't want to go ahead and admit that any of their pilots are bad apples. Do you as a member of the flying public want to go ahead and get on an airplane if 1% of that airplane's or that company's pilots are not any good? And no, of course you don't. And so I just think that once again, it's a smokescreen to go ahead and distract us from the issue at hand. If it really is only 1%, well, then the other 99% need to not be intimidated from speaking out and saying, this guy or this gal's got to go because they're making horrific decisions for the city or the area that they serve in, and they're making all of our jobs more difficult. So I just think that why is it so hard for people who are not causing problems to speak out about those who are? I don't understand.
Thanks, Peter, for sharing, and very enlightening. Pastor Jay, I'm going to pose that same question to you. Why is it that every time a bad cop is identified, you have many people who say that it's only less than 1% of the police officers in America are bad? Where's this number coming from?
I think number one, they're making it up. They're just pulling out a number. How would you know? How would you have any idea? Let's use something that's similar but different. Let's talk about abusive relationships as an example, where you can have a husband who goes to work and he's amazing at his job. Everybody at his job loves him. He's incredible there. He gets things done. He plays in a rec league team. His teammates love him. He's the star of the team. They absolutely adore him, but he goes home and he abuses his wife. Her relationship looks very different. And she may say, hey, he's abusing me. And no one else believes her because the person that we see would never do that. The person that I'm exposed to, the person that I experience, that's not even who he is. I don't see that. And in my opinion, people who've grown up in certain areas, who've been exposed to policing that's done a certain way, it's very hard to perceive that they could treat another person in the way that some of us are saying we get treated. And it can be the same officer. But what I'm saying is, in your neighborhood, just because you don't see it, doesn't mean it doesn't happen. If you come to different neighborhoods, you see different things. And the same person can act one way in one place and go to another place, the exact same person, and act very differently based on the environment, based on his cultural perceptions. Maybe in your neighborhood, people are quieter and he's not used to people being, in his mind, aggressive or loud or anything else. Well, when he comes over to our neighborhoods, we're not even being loud, but it's perceived as such because culturally we may be a little more demonstrative, facial expressions, hand movements, voice volume. And so how he polices in city 1 looks very different in city 2, where he's like, whoa, these people are really aggressive. They're coming at me. They're using their hands. I'm fearing for my life, or I feel like they're being disrespectful. There's so many avenues that I think this conversation can go down. But, in a nutshell, they're pulling the number out of their hat. They're making up something. Number 2, how would you know? There are bad apples in every profession, everywhere. All we've been saying is when you find a bad one, specifically one that has the authority to detain and to take lives, shouldn't he be held to a much higher standard than everyone else?
Thanks for sharing, Jay. Appreciate that. Keisha, I'm going to pose that same question to you. And why is it that every time a bad officer is identified, some people will say that it only represents less than 1% of the police force in America? Where do you think that number is coming from?
Um, just random number that people decide just to use. I don't, at least not from anything that I've read, has said that it's 1%. I've read other articles that had percentages, but it wasn't one. And so I think it's just, and kind of leaning on what was already said, is just people just have this desire, like can't see that it's a large number of people, of cops that are abusive towards a population of people. And yeah, it's hard for people to see that and to believe that, even if you think about the issues generally for the country, like the racial issues for the entire country, it's hard for some white people to see that it's racist, massively racist towards people of color. I've encountered like and built relationships with white people who are just like, well, I don't think it's that bad. It can't be that bad. And it's just more of just from their perception and from their perspective, it's not bad. They think it's good. They think for the most part, we're in a good place. And I think a lot what Pastor Jay was saying is that it's just depending on where they are, they act differently. Like police officers act differently. And we have to not lean on our own experiences and actually listen to what other people are saying. And realize that it's not just a few people that are saying this. This is a whole population of people. And don't lean on the 5 Black people that say it's different. Lean on the hundreds of Black scholars that are saying that this is happening.
Thanks for sharing, Keisha. That's really good. Actually, I had a thought in my mind, actually, as you were talking, but actually you and Jay, because we oftentimes we don't see all sides of people, and if all we see is a great side of a person, it would be fairly difficult to believe anything else. And one thing that I want to throw out there, I mean, completely different. It's almost like finding out, a family member who you love and that you respect and that you care, and you find out they've been molesting another family member. And it's a reason why many of those cases don't get reported, because people don't want to believe it. It's easier not to believe it than to deal with it. But yet you have the victim who's saying like, why won't you believe me? And so I think many families can kind of deal with that one. I mean, can kind of relate to that one, because you don't have to look too far in your family to find that, those are some issues that have transpired. So when you guys were saying that, it's just, again, it's one of those things where we're not with people around the clock, and so we don't have an opportunity to see the bad side as well as the good side. And so, Kurt, I'm going to pose that same question to you. Why is it that every time a bad cop is identified, some people will say that it's only less than 1% of the population who are the police force that's bad? And where do you think that number is coming from?
10% of 1% of 1,000 is 10. 10 bad cops on the force is 10 too many.
All right. I guess he dropped the mic. I'm, I'm waiting for some more, but all right, preacher. All right, Kevin. As we're getting ready to close out, I'm going to pose that same question to you. Why is it that every time a bad cop is identified, some people will say it's only 1% of the police force that's bad? Where's that number coming from?
So where does that number come from? It does not come from studies, from scholarship. It comes from a misunderstanding of what racism is. If the presumption is that racism is about an individual person having a particular motive, then very rarely is there ever racism. But if we understand racism is systemic through societal institutions, and that the issue is that our societal institutions don't have equity in accountability and justice, then it doesn't matter if it's 1% bad apples or 10% bad apples. What if we presume the best of every person and say everyone is a good apple? Good people can still have, with good motives and good intentions, can still have actions that have negative consequences. And when those negative consequences happen, does the system hold them accountable and is justice served? So even framing the question as, 1% bad apples, where that comes from is misunderstanding the situation.
All right. Well, thanks for sharing, Kevin. Appreciate your perspective on it. And I guess the last thing that I would add on that is I think any good cop that does not speak out against a bad cop, how could we call that good? And I think that that's going to be another conversation as we continue to move forward. I want to thank all the people that has joined us tonight. Hopefully, again, our conversation here at the Milwaukee Declaration will help you further the conversations in your circles. So I want to thank Pastor Kevin from Unity Lutheran from being with us tonight. Pastor Peter Borg from City Brook Church. I want to thank Pastor Kurt Boyd from Way of the Cross, Pastor Jay from Plain English, and Keisha from the Impact Movement. Again, just a pleasure to be here to help further the conversation, to help further the gospel. And at the Milwaukee Declaration, our mission is to simply build bridges to racial reconstruction through our love for God and our neighbor. And just ask that you continue to join us in that movement and be part of the solution across racial lines. Thank you for being with us this evening. And until next time, we'll see you later. God bless you.